Russia weaponizes energy to ensure the effects of its campaign in Ukraine reach much further than the borders it has invaded.
All right, y'all, welcome back to Combat Arms channel. Okay, so today we're checking out something from BFBS Creative. Now, we already know they always do some really cool stuff as far as like the cinematography and whatnot, but they always cover some really interesting topics. So the one that they're covering today is the Suwalki Gap. Now, we learned about this recently in the video about Finland joining NATO and how it kind of checkmates Russia, but it's basically you have Belarus and you have Kaliningrad, and if they bridge that gap, they'll sort of be able to cut off Lithuania and Poland and kind of cut off that NATO supply or, action route, that freedom of maneuver. It's not something that I was really, knowledgeable of at all prior to that previous video, but if they're doing a whole video dedicated to that, it's gonna be pretty cool, especially in the context of NATO and, kind of how it's looking right now, where NATO is probably at its strongest, than it has been in a while. So yeah, should be interesting. Let's check it out.
What an incredible time to be stood right here between these three nations.
I'm stood where Europe meets Russia. I've been spending some time in Lithuania, one of NATO's most easterly flanks. I guess you could say it's pretty beautiful here. And although it may be a small country, it's one that's leading the way in its support for Ukraine. I arrived during Iron Wolf, an annual exercise that brings NATO countries together to train in woods, plains, and urban complexes. I'll be meeting up with some old friends from Two Rifles.
Hello, mate.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Oh, okay. I like their setup down here. Like, I haven't seen camo netting be used like as effectively as it is right here.
Hi.
That
Nice.
was Sergeant Price there just behind me. Morning, mate. How's it going? You got time for a little sit rep?
Every time. You've got me a few times, yeah.
They're in the Baltics as part of Estonia's enhanced forward presence, and they've travelled to Lithuania for this exercise.
Nice, okay.
And while I'm here, I thought I'd look into the Suwałki Gap, an area known as NATO's weakest point. But
cool editing.
I want to figure out if there is a credible threat to the region against the backdrop of a large-scale NATO exercise. And as it is Access after all, we'll be getting right up amongst the action.
Dude, nice camouflage, I gotta say.
But before all of that,
Good stuff.
let me try my hand at some geography.
Okay. It's probably gonna do better than I
I've
would,
just
to be
arrived
honest.
somewhere pretty cool. So I'm at a tri-point between three different nations. This is the exact point here, which is marked by this interestingly shaped monument. But basically, behind this green fence
Is it interesting?
is Russia, not mainland Russia obviously, but Kaliningrad Oblast, which is the greater region of Kaliningrad itself. Now that's a hugely strategic place for Russia because it's where it houses its
That looks
Baltic
pretty
Sea
cool.
fleet, and it's also rumoured to
Damn.
house its Iskander-M nuclear-capable missiles, as well as God knows how many troops. So it's of massive strategic importance to Russia and Putin. Now behind this barbed wire just here is Lithuania, which is of course a NATO member state. And bordering that is Poland. So I'm actually stood on Polish soil right now.
Okay.
And straight down here,
That is
right
pretty
behind me
cool.
now, is what's known as the Suwalki corridor, which is really interesting to this story because it's what
Again, it's cool to like actually look at everything on a map and kind of be able to like picture it. But like when you actually see someone who's standing there and you can kind of see the stretch of land, you can kind of picture like what it would be like for them trying to, form a defense around this gap. And yeah, I mean, the terrain looks, I guess, pretty accepting of that, but it looks so like peaceful and chill right now. But knowing that, if things do kick off, there's going to be a lot of military equipment heading to like that specific little gap.
is what's known as the Suwalki corridor, which is really interesting to this story because it's what's known as NATO's weakest point by military strategists. There's really not many NATO assets in the area. It's just rolling hills, farms, grasslands,
So cool.
the odd herd of cattle. But 60 kilometers that way is Belarus, which is of course a
60
Russia-aligned
kilometers.
state.
Damn, I didn't know it was
Let's
that
face it,
close.
a puppet state for Putin, and somewhere where Putin's already
Yeah.
been allowed to amass troops to carry out its invasion of Ukraine. If you think back to the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, there was 30,000 troops allowed into Belarus, and that was one of Russia's key axes for its initial attack, coming from the north, and they were trying to get to Kyiv. But what's really fascinating for me is that Belarus and Russia have actually went through training exercises trying to figure out what a land invasion would look like along this corridor, It's perfect territory for tanks and armor.
Yeah, you need a lot of armor and mechanized infantry.
But why would they do that? Well, that would separate the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia from Poland and the rest of the European Union. Now, obviously that would mean directly attacking a NATO member state, so it's incredibly unlikely. But this has been a pretty crazy year so far, so nothing's out of the question. And obviously with a leader becoming increasingly unpredictable and irrational, who knows?
So that's how the story goes.
Shall we?
Yeah.
A vulnerable stretch of Europe that Russian armor could roll right through, creating a land corridor between Kaliningrad and Belarus.
Again, it looks like so cool, so like peaceful, like nothing going on. But the fact that there's so many military eyes on this area is kind of like unsettling, you know, if you live there or something.
Cutting off supply routes to the Baltics. But what I've learned is that theory plays on a few myths, so I'm going to try and unpack them. The first one being that the terrain would be inviting to armor columns.
Here in Lithuania, it's very wooded, so the armor is very constrained to the tracks. Absolutely plays to our advantage. So
yeah, great for anti-tank teams.
We're spending our time living in the woodlands and exposing ourselves only at points that play to our advantage to destroy armor. What we see every day in Ukraine, but that is that light rail forces can absolutely take on and defeat armoured organisations, provided the terrain is to our advantage. So if you're operating in complex terrain, light rail infantry can wreak havoc against armoured forces.
Yeah, big facts, and we've been seeing that a lot now.
I've just arrived on the Pobrada training area, not too far north of the Suwalki corridor. And just in the tree line behind me, there's Czech BMPs preparing for battle. They're assaulting a urban objective behind the camera. And the Czech BMPs are being supported by Lithuanian combat engineers, as well as infantry support from 2 rifles of the British Army.
Damn, no kidding. Okay, they're really like integrating. Okay, so yeah, the BMPs, you got the engineers clearing the way, and then you got the British infantry that are going to be going in and kind of like clearing everything out. That's pretty cool. Again, I've worked with NATO forces, and I think the most integrated we got is having like a squad of Romanian infantry like alongside a squad of infantry Marines, and that's kind of the closest we got. We got to use their RPGs, and they got to use some of our laws. That was pretty much it.
So yeah, it's super peaceful in this forest right now. It's beautiful, but things are about to get heavy.
What's going to happen, so Watkins and his team are going to go forward, take over the front. We're going to go start smashing. Does that make sense? I want looking out to the flanks. Forwards are okay. I want rear. Go and get your teams. Tell them what the plan is. Get them around this wagon.
Terrain is a big one. Although Lithuania is relatively flat, its woods and forests make armour susceptible to ambush from light rail forces.
This is complex terrain, and the reason we're playing through this is because, as you can clearly see, a vehicle wouldn't be able to pass through this. So you need like infantry like ourselves just to push up to the flanks to support the armoured thrust that's coming up that main track now. And that way we're just clearing any dismounted threats that could take out that armoured threat around the battle group to push up towards our final objective.
As we've seen in Ukraine, just one man with a javelin can ruin a T-90 crew's day.
Hell
we're fighting against armour today, where we see dismounted troops are likely going to see Boxers, CVR-90s, sentry tanks as well in and around those positions. So today we'll likely be looking to hold. We have our own anti-tank missiles in the platoon, which will probably launch onto those armoured threats. But more realistically, we'll be looking to use the Lithuanian Jab platoon in our reserve, so holding that threat, bringing them up to destroy that armoured vehicle and then pressing on.
Oh my god, his pack looks like a nightmare. It looks like it's destroying his lower back right now. I like the way he's talking though. Like you can tell he knows exactly, like he understands the tactical level, but he also understands like more of the operational and strategic level of what it means to be in this terrain and have the specific weapons that they're going to try and implement on certain specific targets, specifically like armored targets. And that's another reason why I really love these BFBS Creative videos, because they really get in with the leadership, and they have these interviews with the people who are training there, and you can kind of see that they have a good understanding of why they're there and what the kind of overall intent is for that training.
Awesome. That's all I've got for you.
Awesome, man. I appreciate that.
Infantry, when working hand in hand with armour and air
Sick
support,
rifle.
could make the Suwalki Gap a pretty unwelcoming place.
We've just arrived at 2 Rifles Command Post for the evening. I'm about to catch up with Lieutenant Harris, who the real fans of Access may remember from our Kenya episode. So he's now the 2IC of A Company.
Nice.
And I'm told he's just in the back of this wagon now, so gonna go see what he's up to.
It sounds like a command post already. Generators and stuff going.
Joe,
How's it going?
yeah, all good. How are
Good
you?
to see you, mate. Yeah, very well, thank you.
Not
Mind
too
if I
bad.
take a pew?
Yeah, go
Dude.
for it.
Good stuff, man. Cheers.
Nice
Talk to me a bit
setup.
about
That's
Lithuania, like,
impressive.
what's the terrain like? What are you guys dealing with here?
So, very much like Estonia. Fortunately, now that we've come a little bit south, it's not as cold, which is good. And the terrain's a lot more undulating in parts. Estonia is flat, very, very flat and heavily forested. So, as light infantry, it's good ground. We can cover it, but we'd like a bit of terrain to make use of as well, whether that be cover from fire, cover from view. Whereas here, we've got plenty of that to play with, and getting.
Yeah, that is true. Like, I don't know, it's an interesting thing with infantry. Like, at least when I was really young in the infantry, I always looked at terrain that was really like wide and kind of expansive. I'm like, okay, sweet. Like, this is the type of terrain I'd like to walk through. But in the Marine Corps, you have like these, what we trained a lot was just like getting online and kind of like buddy rushing through these big open fields.
Hey, keep shifting left! Keep shifting left!
But it's not really realistic, and it's not going to happen like that in peer-to-peer conflict. Definitely not going to happen. So being able to employ the terrain and kind of move through the terrain and use it for that sort of planning and movement purposes makes a lot more sense than just having a bunch of infantry just get online across an open field. So that was something I never understood why we trained like that. Hopefully it's not the same now. In the Army, we don't really do that too much. So it is kind of cool that they get to have some terrain to work with.
Here, near that to play with, and getting reintroduced to hills is actually quite a novelty, having spent such a long time training on flat training areas. So all in all, it's good. We've been able to use the ground to our best ability, whether that be in forests or in the open, and crossing other complicated urban terrain.
Oh, yeah.
The Suwalki corridor isn't far from here.
All the track marks.
It's known as NATO's weakest point.
Yeah.
Discuss.
So absolutely, I mean, it's an area that NATO needs to take seriously, and I guess that's why they're important. It's important there are NATO forces nearby. In terms of particular threat there, I mean, the threat is very real right across the border with Russia, whether you're in Estonia or you're here in Lithuania or Latvia or indeed Poland.
Myth number 2 is that there aren't many NATO assets in the area. But you heard the Colonel, there are. In fact, I've just been walking around a forest with some. So, let's take a look at NATO's enhanced forward presence. What is it and who's here? Keir Giles has been studying Russia for over 30 years, and I caught up with him at the launch of his latest book, Russia's War on Everybody.
I like the
when
design.
The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, joined NATO in 2004, NATO was determinedly not presenting Russia as a threat. And so, as a result, they found that they were members of NATO, but without actually any plan to protect or defend them against Russia, against their biggest security threat. It took over a decade and the Russian seizure of Crimea to focus NATO's minds on the fact that actually, if you have member states that are that exposed to Russia, you're supposed to be defending them.
Cool shots.
Now, each of those member states, each of those new members of the alliance that were on Russia's frontiers, recognized that their biggest vulnerability was if Russia attacked them, but at the same time could persuade NATO that it wasn't a NATO problem. If they could prevent NATO reaching agreement on supporting one of their member states that was under attack. So the solution was to get as many different NATO member states involved in the defense of those countries as possible. And that's what lies behind the structure of the enhanced forward presence units. They're brought together from many different member states in order that there's no conversation about whether or not the rest of NATO is involved in the event of some kind of attack on those Baltic states, because they're already present. They don't need to reconquer territory. They're already on the front line. And
like a double show of force, I guess?
Conversation about whether Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty applies in any given instance simply isn't going to happen. It means that the Baltic states have been the most secure that they've been in hundreds of years because they have that undeniable support from allies that are further west.
Yeah, and that's true. Even when I was in Romania and Bulgaria, when we were doing like the Black Sea rotational force, there was a lot of people going up to the Baltics and doing training there. So, I mean, that was over the course of 7 months or so. And that's like a rotational thing. So you always have people going there. So what he's saying is definitely true. There's a lot of people moving in and out, especially like NATO forces, doing training, working together. And yeah, it's cool to see. I don't know how it compared to previously, but of course, like we can see now with everything going on with Russia, people are taking that pretty seriously.
2 of NATO's enhanced forward presence battle groups either side of Suwalki. Poland's is US-led and based roughly 100 kilometers to the south. Lithuania's is based in Rukla, around 2 hours drive to the north. Led by Germany, it's made up of troops from Belgium, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Norway, and even Luxembourg.
Okay.
The exercise Iron Wolf shows that we are combat ready. And with this combat readiness, we show that we can deter, and if deterrence fails, we are ready to fight for the Lithuanians and with our NATO partners and defend the NATO eastern flank. We are ready for this.
Is it 1 layer or 2 layers?
That dude was confident.
Okay, do the animals.
Good stuff.
We're going to get the engineers to punch forward, right? We're going to blow a hole in that razor wire. There's a load of open ground. We're going to clear that smooth and fast as possible. We're going to take 2 more rows of razor wire out and we're going to launch onto Alpha 3. As I told you earlier, yeah? Happy with the plan? Yeah, we've got machine guns firing us in the whole way. We've got our own integral fire support as well.
This is the fun part where things are happening.
I'm about 500 meters from the objective now. I'm with some Lithuanian combat engineers and 3 platoon of 2 rifles.
Oh yeah.
So they're going to work together. They've identified.
Okay, so the tactics looks pretty much the same. So you got the one dude carrying like I'm guessing like the ladder and whatnot to throw over the sea wire. That happens a lot when you're doing like breaches. You have somebody with a ladder, maybe somebody with a grappling hook, so you can kind of get over the obstacles, or the wire obstacles, or just pull them in to defeat them. But with engineers, I imagine we're gonna have some Bangalores. My favorite to watch was the APOBs, which is like this thing that shoots a rocket with like a string of grenades attached to it and blows up. It's pretty freaking cool to watch.
Rocket!
They're going to work together. Cool. They've identified that there's a few sections of barbed wire which they're going to have to get past and then continue the assault onto the objective from there. So it's about to get pretty leery here.
Oh yeah.
As the Lithuanian engineers prepare to breach out of cover, my mind turns to myth number 3. Much of the narrative around the Suwalki Gap seems to imply that Poland and the Baltics would just sit back and watch an invasion happen.
Engineers, go!
I don't know about that.
Lithuania was the first country to completely wean itself off Russian gas. For a small country on Russia's frontier, that's actually pretty huge.
That's
Russia weaponizes energy to ensure the effects of its campaign in Ukraine reach much further than the borders it has invaded.
And they gotta do triple strand?
It's one of the reasons I'm scared to put the heating on.
Oh, they got the obscuration going, so that's good. It's not the best placement, but it's alright, it'll work. Damn, that's a lot of sandbags.
So I'm with the Lithuanian engineers. They've just snipped the first section of barbed wire, and now you see right behind me now, 2 rifles are beginning their advance now. I'm guessing the Lithuanian engineers are going to have to punch forward yet again and get the next section of barbed wire. To imagine a real situation, how dangerous that job is.
Yeah.
Here we go again. Let's go.
All right. It feels cooler running through the smoke.
Lithuania really is leading the way in standing up to Russia. They've limited the amount of visas that they're issuing to Russian tourists. They've blockaded goods to Kaliningrad. They're providing a huge amount of lethal aid to Ukraine, and they've taken in thousands of Ukrainian refugees.
Damn.
And walking around Vilnius, you don't have to look far to get a sense of what this city really thinks about Putin.
Okay. Nice. Hell yeah, dude.
Yes,
they're
these
really not
countries
messing
are
around.
willing to stand up to Russia because they know what the alternative is. They will invest in making themselves as little dependent on Russia as possible because they know that the cost of dependence on Russia are much greater. And that expresses itself not just in these non-military means, paying a higher price for gas in order that you are not dependent on Russia for it, because you know that that dependency can be exploited at any time. It also extends into how they see themselves defending themselves against Russia in an open conflict. If you look at the consequences for the Baltic states of surrendering to the Soviet Union in 1940, and then compare that with the experience of Finland, which resisted for as long as it possibly could before signing an armistice, the two experiences are so far apart that it's convinced many people in the Baltic states that fighting to the end is a better alternative, that they cannot surrender again, they cannot have a repeat of that situation in the 20th century when for decades they were under the domination of Moscow and suffered horrifically as a result.
Definitely the mindset to have, especially now.
And if, in the event of a land grab towards Kaliningrad, there was any dispute about whether that invoked NATO's Article 5, there's more options still.
One of the reasons for the setting up of the Joint Expeditionary Force, whether it's stated or not, is to work around this vulnerability of NATO. That you are reliant on all of NATO countries actually sharing that idea of what constitutes security and what an appropriate response to Russian actions is. So if you have an alliance, a sub-alliance of like-minded countries that you can rely on both to respond appropriately and to recognize a situation as it develops, then that works around some of NATO's weakness. And that's why you see this arc of countries across the top of Europe who all have the same idea about the threat and will all be reliable in terms of responding to it, working together in a parallel organization to ensure that they can actually deliver capabilities when needed.
Okay, yeah, I remember hearing about that.
So I think it's really important, isn't it, that nations, the NATO nations are standing shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, it definitely helps with the reassurance. I mean, when you have like any sort of doubt in the back of your mind as far as, you know, how these other countries, or specifically NATO, are going to support. But when you see them, you know, constantly doing these exercises, signing these alliances, and then you have people who are making actions to, again, like wean themselves off of that Russian oil, like people are definitely showing that they're serious about this, serious about the commitment. So having all of that sort of together really helps to allow people to at least get into that mindset and really support it.
NATO nations are standing shoulder to shoulder, demonstrating that they are absolutely committed to one another, particularly at this time. And it's really important that NATO organizations are exercising like this to demonstrate their capability both to each other, but also to potential adversaries who might be looking on.
So in the unlikely event of an invasion, Lithuania and Poland would surely not sit back and watch it happen. And they certainly wouldn't be alone in standing up. And now that brings me to myth 4. Would it even be of strategic value to Russia to close the Suwalki Gap? I mean, they already have Kaliningrad.
The Suwałki Gap has been presented as an interesting target, a useful target for Russia to intervene. But what we suggest is, first of all, it's not that useful. And second of all, the circumstances under which Russia might actually want to seek control of this territory are so remote that it probably wouldn't be a target except in the circumstances of a much broader conflict. It simply doesn't serve Russia's objectives to make a grab for this patch of land in the way that's been described in a lot of Western analysis. In addition, you have...
Okay, so unless there's like a big sort of conflict going on, they're not going to be trying to get these huge land grabs, like trying to completely cut off the Baltics. It'll kind of be a little bit slower and maybe just more dedicated to smaller areas. I think it's kind of what he's saying. But if it was like a larger scale conflict, it'd be more of like a strategic advantage than anything else.
In addition, you have to ask, what exactly is it that Russia would gain from moving on this area? Because if you are risking an open conflict with NATO, you have to assume that the situation is far, far worse between Russia and NATO already. And presumably this would be part of a much wider conflict where the significance of this small patch of land becomes much less. A lot of the scenarios that people have described for Russia making that grab are dependent on Belarus cooperating in a way that we have simply not seen up until now from Minsk. The picture seems to be that they have been not willing, obviously, to go to war with Russia, but also not willing to go to war for Russia, because they knew that this would mean the destruction of Belarus as they knew it. So a lot of the assumptions that lay behind this idea that Russia could move suddenly on the Suwalki Gap don't really seem to have stood up to the test of what happens about Belarus. Certainly there are now Russian troops present in Belarus in a way that there were not previously, and there are in Kaliningrad, but it takes more than that to actually move on this NATO corridor.
So to finish up, let me throw back.
That's why it's nice having these experts, because they provide a lot of that context and kind of the trends of what we've seen already.
To the start of this video, my piece to camera at the tri-point. It was May 2022, and I'd been filming an exercise in Poland. When I arrived at the tri-point, I'd only had time to do a short amount of research on the Suwalki Gap. The first page of Google is made up of reputable sources talking about the significance of this stretch of land, with some almost gearing the reader up for an impending invasion. Some of the things I said were plainly repeating elements from these articles.
Perfect territory for tanks and armour. There's really not many NATO assets in the area. Let's face it, a puppet state for Putin.
7 months on, I returned to Lithuania for Iron Wolf, and by this time, I'd been immersed in this story for some time.
Okay, I like that.
I'd spoken to different
himself.
sources, asked military experts, quizzed people who've been researching these things for much longer than myself, and I've come out of the back of it with a slightly different point of view. So what have I learned? Don't take anything surrounding conflict at face value. Check your sources and have multiple. Gather facts for yourself on the ground and always ask why. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. And if you're watching this, then certainly don't believe me. Check for yourself, check again, and then make your own mind up. Not just about the Suwalki Gap, but everything. Disinformation is everywhere. Narratives are loaded, and some sources plainly don't have a clue. So, do I think that the Suwalki Gap is NATO's weakest point? Honestly, I still have no idea. At the end of the day, I'm just another outside observer. What I have seen for myself is that countries are stronger when they're together.
You on the right, you on the left, and we remain that way the whole way.
And so for me, NATO's weakest point would be being divided.
First surface of Russian involvement in politics in the Scottish referendum 6 years ago.
Interference with the internet and destructive interference as well as hacking.
The allegation that Russian money bought victory in the EU referendum.
Did Russia interfere?
So, I'll always question
that
why.
Happen.
When something seeks to do just that.
Shall we? Yep.
Did Russia
interference as well as hacking.
The allegation.
Okay, so this is kind of cool how they're kind of shifting other sort of points of weakness that NATO should be concerned with.
That Russian money bought victory in the EU referendum.
Cool way to finish the video, I guess.
So, I'll always question why. When something seeks to do just that.
Shall we? Yep.
Hell yeah. Good stuff. Damn. And I don't know how many people he had supporting this, but that was very, very well done. Yeah, definitely not surprised by the quality that we're seeing here. I mean, it's pretty much been a standard when it comes to this channel. But again, a very, very interesting topic. And I do kind of like how he was like fact checking himself and whatnot. But it's not something that a lot of Americans even think of. I mean, it seems like such a European issue. But again, when you're thinking about NATO, you need to look at these gaps, these potential weaknesses, because it's going to be something that you can expect the enemy to try and exploit. I mean, I know I have a lot of buddies in Poland, so I kind of want to talk to them and hear their perspective, see if they're learning a little bit about this sort of gap, or if they're kind of focusing on other things and kind of learning a little bit about that as well. But yeah, very interesting. Again, it gets the gear spinning. It opens the concept or the mind, the perspective to a lot of other issues that are out there, a lot of other things to consider. When you're talking about just like at a face value, yeah, it looks like, you know, you have this gap that they could potentially exploit to kind of cut off certain land and kind of enclose the Baltics like that. But again, when you have like these experts that are talking about the trends that we've seen and kind of adding a little bit more clarity as to what we might expect, it definitely helps to understand, you know, what's going on or what you can kind of picture happening with that area during certain specific conflicts. But let me know what you guys think. Of course, if you have anything else to add to the video, throw it down below. I always love hearing what you guys have to say. A lot of y'all are a lot more knowledgeable than, I mean, myself, but also sometimes the people in the video. A lot of y'all are like, kind of like the experts at a lot of different things. Kind of like how he was saying, you have to take certain things with a grain of salt and then kind of do your own research. But again, it is nice having this awesome community where you have people who know a lot or have read a bunch or, you know, have lived in certain areas, seen certain things happen. They can provide that input, and it just gives us a better idea of what we can kind of expect out of certain things and just give us more clarity with certain stuff. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. Very cool video. Of course, I'll put the original down in the video description so you guys can go and check out the original channel because they do some really, really good stuff if you guys haven't seen me react to their stuff before. But that is it for this video. I'll see y'all in the next one.